Hi, Moss here, and today I have Audio GD's R2R11. Now, it's been almost 10 years since I first discovered Audio GD, and then back then, I bought a nice pair of headphones, and then I was told on Headfi, oh, you have to buy a good headphone amp for them to sound good. So I bought a good headphone amp, plugged it into my computer, and not much of an improvement. And then they said, oh no, you need a good DAC. So I bought a nice DAC, and then it's all very tedious. So I ended up suggesting to Kingwo of Audio GD that he make a combined DAC amp. Now, one of the things we were using back then was this kind of dodgy $99 DAC amp thing from China, and we were modifying it actually with Kingwo's discrete op amps. And then once we did all the modifications, everything came to about $250. So I asked Kingwo, can you make something for about $250 that will do all that? And well, it came out at $350 and was called the Audio GD Compass because it was his first kind of big international push. And in the end, over the last 10 years, the kind of $350 mark has been the kind of standard price above, say, $99 components, or, if you combine, once you combine all $99 components like the shit audio ones, you get, around the $200 mark. It's just that even with allowing for inflation, it's kind of like a standard price. So the $350 R2R11 and other $350 components, something I thought I'd look into because it's kind of the entry-level high-quality audio gear that people are interested in buying. So with that, I'm going to review a number and compare a number of components in that kind of price range. We're probably going to shift down to $200 and shift up a bit to $400. So let's take a look at the R2R11. Inside the box, the R2R11 comes with a power cord, a USB cable with a noise suppressing ferrite on it, and a little bag consisting of a spare LED, spare stick-on feet, and some jumpers for changing settings inside the unit. The R2R11 itself is about 26 centimeters deep or so. That's, socket to volume knob. So about 10 inches, a bit over. And it's about 18 centimeters wide, I measured. So it's not quite as wide as a CTH, but it's a bit deeper. There's, as you can see, a lot crammed in here, and for various reasons, yeah, it does look quite complex. Now, starting with the power, this is your transformer, which takes the incoming voltage and transforms it down to a voltage suitable for running a DAC and amp, and then you have your power supply in here, which has to filter and optimize that incoming voltage and smooth things out to make it nice, even DC voltage for all the components. Then at the back you have your inputs. A lot of the input circuitry is under here. You won't see it. You can just see the bottom of the USB board, which is mounted upside down. And it's so close to the ladder modules that literally the capacitors are like a millimeter off the board. If I tilt that up, you can probably just see that. You can see these capacitors in there, if I just point carefully, and they're literally a millimeter from the board. And there's a capacitor at the back that's on the DAC board that's a millimeter from the USB board. It's very, very tight fit. Pretty amazing work there, and this is all carefully built by hand. You can see some of the hand soldering in there. The DAC modules are the DA8 modules, which you see in also other Audio GD DACs, and there are a couple of those in there. If I tilt this up, you can see that the DAC modules in there, so get it in the middle. And they have, of course, the resistor arrays. Now, in the old R2R chips, this is all inside a chip, but inside they're hand-built ladder modules. So there are the resistors there in these ladders, and they're switched by these switch circuits here. Now that means, someone asked me, how is DSD processed in these? Well, interesting, it's not processed by this resistor array ladder, that's for PCM. For DSD it uses a separate resistor ladder with separate switches for handling that. So you actually have two arrays there, one for PCM and one for DSD, and it's all controlled through programmed logic chip, a Xilinx FPGA. So that's how resistor boards work, and each board has its own chip, and they have their own firmware and setup, and it can't be readily upgraded in this model. In the higher models it can. I suppose you could disassemble the whole thing and upgrade it, but it has a firmware that controls all of that. Now the output then goes through these amplification arrays, and they look quite complex, and that's because you're seeing, normally companies would use op-amp chips, so they're little, the little chips that control it have an entire circuit. And you can actually see an op-amp which would be for the DC offset, yeah. So you could fit all of this inside a chip this size if you really wanted to, and keep it even more compact. But Kingwo likes the sound of his own circuits and his own designs, and then he can tweak them as necessary and optimize the sound, which is something you can't quite do with an op-amp. You're kind of stuck with whatever design and sound that has. So he's built his own literal op-amps on the circuit board there. And if you want the sound a little bit kind of warmer sounding, there are a couple of jumpers here which will probably put in engage a couple of capacitors, I guess, to soften the sound slightly, or maybe change the circuit. I'm not sure. Now you also have another feature in here. Now normally the preamp switch and DAC switch at the front, the DAC switch will still be in preamp mode, and that's to stop someone accidentally blowing out their speakers or whatever. So to actually use it in pure DAC mode, without just turning the volume to max, to bypass the volume, you actually have to pull out this jumper here and switch it over one notch, and that will engage, I guess it affects this relay here and switches it through to pure DAC mode where there's no volume control engaged. And you see the volume control is actually mounted on this board. It's actually an Alps potometer, full size one, actually mounted on underneath this board and connected via a little ribbon cable. So you can see that's very complex, very amazingly complex. A lot of stuff crammed in there and a lot of work, obviously. So I think that's why a lot of people like the Audio GD products. They feel like they're getting a lot for their money. The Schiit audio gear is really tiny, of course, in comparison. Looks really, really tiny. But if you think about it, now this is just an amp, so if I unplug this Valley 2 here, if we put a little Valley 2 on here, we can see, well, look at that. It only takes up a fraction of the space. That's kind of even on the edge. But if we grab another component, some other components, like we have a, well, I don't want to unplug I've got the Modi multi-bit under here. I won't unplug that. I'll just put this as an equivalent to the Modi multi-bit. Same size chassis. So there's the DAC that's sitting on top. And what did we see inside? What did we see that was all here? Power supply. So it's kind of equivalent. So what they've put in wall warts is sitting, inside the case in here. So it's kind of equivalent in size. It's either one box or multiple boxes. You kind of have a choice in what you get there. So Audio GD goes with its one box thing. The original NFB11, which is the Sigma Delta version using Sabre chips, was, they used the same chassis and it had been quite popular. In that, you get all your controls on the front. In this case, your headphone socket, your headphone variable or preamp switch or fixed, and we saw inside, to get the fixed thing doesn't work, it's still variable until you change that jumper. Then your low and high gain, and your three inputs, coaxial, USB and optical. To get to the back, standard setup with the power input on the right, your preamp or DAC output on the left, optical, USB and coaxial. And that's your basic setup with the R2R11. When it comes to listening, the R2R11 has 3.5 watts of output power, which is more than enough to drive everything here comfortably, albeit, it'll be driving everything pretty much in Class A, B mode. I also, like other Audio GD amps, it was pretty quiet. I did the good old Andromeda test where you plug in a pair of Campfire Audio Andromedas and turn the volume up until you start to get hiss. And I did have to turn it pretty high, kind of way above listening level before I got any significant amount of hiss from them. So in terms of listening, with the Andromedas, if you're curious, actually it was around the 9 o'clock mark that I kind of got a mid-level listening volume, and up much higher was starting to get quite loud. So it doesn't allow for a great amount of volume range for very sensitive IEMs, but given that the output power, it makes it quite a flexible amp in terms of what it can drive. So in that it did quite well. Maybe when listening to what kind of sound does it have? Well, like its Audio GD's standard presentation, it's kind of flat and even, and maybe kind of a touch soft. And I thought a touch soft because I compared it to Schiit Audio's $350 stack, which would be the Modi Multibit, which is also an R2R DAC, and the Magni 3, which is their basic $99 amp, and that had a fairly similar presentation, but maybe with a bit of sharper presentation, a bit of more clear sounding from the Schiit Audio stack, and the Audio GD maybe a touch softer and maybe a touch more forgiving. But in both cases, they were kind of comparable in resolution. In listening, I kind of got a soundstage that was kind of flat and even, but it didn't seem very super wide, or there didn't seem to have much depth. It's still very listenable. Like if you get up in the morning, even despite the more expensive gear I have here, you could get up, switch it on, plug in some headphones, and listen. And both systems were still pleasant and capable and enjoyable to listen to. But with higher end systems, obviously the dynamics are going to be better, and that things like drum impacts are going to sound more substantial out of a better amp, such as the Lear 3. and soundstage depth is going to be more apparent from the higher end amps, and that's kind of what you get when you start to jump up to better gear, and especially more so when you jump up to very expensive gear. Just for fun, I plugged actually the R2R11 into my main system, which consists of an Audio GD Master 10 amp and a pair of LAC4 standing speakers. And that, before I did the comparison with using this first, I could clearly make out that, you know, it was the presentation wasn't softer, not as clear, kind of more vague, and lacked the kind of depth, you know, the more, you know, the high-end gear had. But all the same, it was interesting to, as a basic DAC amp, it actually worked out quite well, and is certainly not 1/8 of certainly the more expensive gear isn't 8 times the sound quality, you know, given that they're 8 times the price. Still, these systems redeem themselves quite well, and especially given that, you know, a lot of modern music isn't, you know, highly detailed. It's kind of compressed and mixed in many ways that doesn't make it so great. You know, these kinds of systems, the basic system, are very pleasant to listen with. And in that, you know, ladder DACs do have that aspect to them where maybe probably much due to some very, very low level even order harmonics, they do have a kind of very I want to listen to music kind of presentation. And, you know, with the Modi Multibit with this kind of lively presentation, even if it's not the most accurate. And likewise, you know, a resistor ladder board ladder DAC isn't going to be the most technically accurate, but it just was very pleasant to listen with. So, of course, in comparison, you have tube amps, and the tube amps have a more kind of entertaining sound. You know, it's obviously slightly coloured because tubes tend to present a slightly coloured presentation. So, you know, if I compared, you know, something like the Valley 2 or the Cavalli Tube Hybrid was a little bit more entertaining to listen with, and then switching back to these kinds of rigs, these rigs sounded a little bit more flat, and that kind of sounded a little bit more boring in comparison. And again, I've said in the past, comparisons are evil. When you start comparing, you start going, but, you know, if you buy one of these setups, you will kind of enjoy it for basic listening with even a fairly wide variety of headphones, and you don't have to worry about too much about having enough power. You know, they won't do as well as, you know, the higher end gear, but they still will do quite capably if, you know, putting on your desk and listening. And most of it comes down to the features and form factor to decide, you know, whether you know, do you want the little stack with the wall warts here? Do you want to, you know, buy from the, you know, Shit Audio particularly? Do you like them? Or do you want the kind of the larger variety of features that this comes with, given that it has, you know, instant switch to pre-out mode? Even though the Magni 3 does have a pre-out option, it's not switchable. And, you know, you have the 2 gain settings. You know, this doesn't have any gain settings, and this has, you know, the 3 inputs on here, although this also has 3 inputs. And, you know, with all that's available, kind of the Audio GD maybe wins a little bit on, you know, feature-wise, but, you know, the Shit Audio stack is kind of smaller and neater and wall-wart powered. So it's kind of, you know, what your personal preferences come down to as to which kind of thing you'll buy. So that's pretty much the Audio GD R2R11. It's certainly a good entry-level product. I actually was surprised how good it sounded just plugging headphones in straight away, despite the fact that I had some high-end gear here.